He was born on the edge of America, an island in the middle of the Pacific, as far from Washington, D.C. as you can get and still be part of the United States. His father was a Kenyan economist who had come to Hawaii on a scholarship and would eventually leave, not just the island, but the family entirely. His mother was a white woman from Kansas, idealistic and restless, who believed the world was bigger than the zip code she grew up in. Barack Hussein Obama II arrived into the world on August 4, 1961, in Honolulu, Hawaii, and from his very first breath, the question of who he was, and where he belonged, was not a simple one. Think about that for a moment. The man who would one day be the most powerful person on earth began life as something genuinely difficult to categorize. Half black, half white. Born in a state that had only recently joined the Union. Son of a man most Americans had never heard of, from a continent most Americans rarely thought about. If you had told anyone in 1961 that this baby boy would grow up to occupy the Oval Office, they would have laughed at you, not out of cruelty, but because the sheer improbability of it was staggering. His early years were defined by movement and adaptation. When his parents' marriage collapsed and his father returned to Kenya, young Barack was raised primarily by his mother, and Dunham, a remarkable woman in her own right, a cultural anthropologist who taught her son that the world was a place worth understanding deeply, not just surviving in. She remarried an Indonesian man named Lolo Sitoro, and so the family moved to Jakarta when Barack was 6 years old. Indonesia in the late 1960s was a place of stark contrasts, rapid development and grinding poverty side by side, political instability just beneath the surface, a world utterly unlike anything he had known in Hawaii. Obama has written about those years in Jakarta with clear-eyed fondness and unflinching honesty. He learned to eat dog meat and snake and grasshopper. He played in fields and alleyways with children who had nothing. He watched his mother navigate a world that was not hers with grace and curiosity. And he absorbed, almost without knowing it, the lesson that would define his entire career, that the lives of ordinary people, in all their messiness and dignity, matter. That every story is worth hearing. But Dunham was worried that her son's education was slipping, that the local school in Jakarta wasn't giving him what he needed. And so, at age 10, Barack Obama was sent back to Hawaii, back to his grandparents, Stanley and Madeline Dunham, back to Honolulu, back to Punahou School, one of the most prestigious private schools in the state. It was there, in those corridors filled predominantly with white and Asian students from affluent families, that Obama first had to confront the full weight of being black in America. He was one of only a handful of black students at Punahou. He excelled academically, but socially, he was navigating treacherous terrain. He has spoken candidly about his teenage years, experimenting with marijuana and cocaine, searching desperately for an identity that felt authentic, wrestling with the question of what it meant to be black when he had grown up in such a racially ambiguous environment. His father, the man whose name and race he carried, was essentially a stranger. He had visited Barack only once, when the boy was 10, and that visit had been more confusing than clarifying. And yet, Obama did not fall apart. Something in him, some combination of his mother's intellectual curiosity, his grandparents' steady love, and his own fierce ambition, kept him moving forward. He graduated from Punahou and went to Occidental College in Los Angeles for 2 years before transferring to Columbia University in New York City. Columbia in the early 1980s was a crucible. Obama threw himself into political thought, into philosophy, into the great questions of justice and power. He graduated in 1983 and moved to Chicago, a city that would become the true forge of his political identity. Chicago's South Side in the mid-1980s was a community in crisis. Steel mills had closed. Unemployment had ravaged entire neighborhoods. Churches and community organizations were the only thing holding some blocks together. Obama took a job as a community organizer, a phrase that would later be mocked on the campaign trail, but which represented something genuinely hard and genuinely important. For 3 years, he worked in the Altgeld Gardens housing project, trying to get asbestos removed from apartments, trying to get job training programs funded, trying to convince bureaucracies that the people living there were worth their attention. He was not always successful. In fact, he failed more often than he won. But he learned something that no law school or political science class can teach: how power actually works at the street level, who holds it, who is excluded from it, and what it takes to shift it even slightly in favor of those who have none. And it was in Chicago that he found his cause, his community, and eventually, his wife. Michelle Robinson was working as a lawyer at the firm Sidley Austin when a young summer associate named Barack Obama arrived. She was assigned to be his advisor. She thought he was probably arrogant. He was immediately captivated. Their courtship was careful and deliberate on her part, passionate and persistent on his. They married in 1992. And Michelle Obama would prove to be not merely a supportive spouse but one of the most formidable political partners in American history, a woman whose intelligence, directness, and moral clarity would complement and challenge her husband in equal measure throughout their life together. But first, law school. Obama had enrolled at Harvard Law School in 1988, and what happened there announced to the world, or at least to those paying attention, that something unusual was happening. In 1990, he became the first black president of the Harvard Law Review, a student-run journal that is one of the most prestigious in the country. It was a genuine milestone, one that earned him his first national press coverage. He graduated magna cum laude in 1991 and returned to Chicago, where he could have taken any number of lucrative corporate law positions. Instead, he chose civil rights law, teaching constitutional law at the University of Chicago, and politics. His entry into elected office was not a triumphant march. It was halting, human, and occasionally humiliating. He served in the Illinois State Senate beginning in 1997, working on healthcare and criminal justice reform with quiet determination. And then, in 2000, he made a fateful mistake. He challenged incumbent Democratic Congressman Bobby Rush in a primary election and was crushed. Rush was a former Black Panther, a beloved figure in the community, and Obama, still seen by many as an outsider, a Harvard-educated academic who hadn't paid his dues, lost by more than 30 points. That defeat could have ended the story right there. Many political careers have been buried by a loss that big, that public, that decisive. But Obama processed the humiliation, learned from it, and kept going. He returned to the Illinois Senate, built coalitions, developed a reputation as a pragmatic legislator who could work across the aisle without surrendering his principles, and he waited for his moment. It came in 2004. The United States Senate seat from Illinois was open, and Obama ran. He was not the front runner. But in the primary, as other candidates' campaigns collapsed under scandal and opposition research, Obama's steady, thoughtful campaign kept gaining ground. He won the primary. And then, in July of 2004, he was given the keynote address slot at the Democratic National Convention in Boston, and the world changed. There is not a liberal America and a conservative America, there is the United States of America. There is not a Black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America, there's the United States of America. He was 32 minutes into the speech when the hall was his completely, and he wasn't finished. It was one of those rare performances in political history where you can feel, watching the footage, the exact moment the audience stops listening and starts believing. By the time he walked off that stage, Barack Obama was no longer a promising Illinois state senator. He was a phenomenon. He won his Senate race that November by the largest margin in Illinois history. And almost immediately, the whispers began. Could this man run for president? Should he? He was, after all, just beginning his first term in the Senate. But conventional wisdom said wait. Get experience, build a record, run in 2016. But conventional wisdom, Barack Obama had learned, was just another name for the assumption that the world could not change quickly. He announced his candidacy in February 2007, standing in the bitter cold outside the old state capitol in Springfield, Illinois, the city where Abraham Lincoln had launched his own improbable run for the presidency. What followed was one of the most extraordinary campaigns in the history of American democracy. The Democratic primary against Hillary Clinton was 18 months of grinding, brilliant, sometimes bruising political combat between two historic candidates, one who would be the first serious woman candidate for the presidency, one who would be the first serious black candidate. Obama ran on a message of hope and change that his opponents initially dismissed as empty rhetoric. His campaign was built on small-dollar donations and grassroots organizing, using the internet in ways no campaign had ever done before. And he could speak. God, could he speak? In a political era of calculated messaging and poll-tested phrases, here was a man who seemed to say what he actually believed, in full sentences, with grace and precision. The Iowa caucuses on January 3, 2008 were decisive. Iowa is overwhelmingly white. If Obama could win there, he could prove that his appeal crossed racial lines. He won Iowa. He lost New Hampshire. He won South Carolina. He lost Nevada. The race went on, grinding, punishing, month after month, until the mathematics finally became undeniable. On June 3, 2008, Barack Obama secured enough delegates to become the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. The general election against Republican Senator John McCain was contested in the shadow of catastrophe. The financial crisis of September 2008 hit like a depth charge, destroying the economy and upending the political landscape. Obama's steadiness in the face of that crisis, his refusal to panic, his measured and serious engagement with economic policy, contrasted sharply with McCain's more erratic response. On November 4, 2008, Barack Hussein Obama was elected the 44th President of the United States with 365 Electoral College votes and 52.9% of the popular vote. That night in Grant Park, Chicago, before a crowd of 250,000 people, with hundreds of millions more watching around the world, Obama walked out onto a stage under the open sky and spoke. He was calm. He was joyful. He was, for perhaps the only time in the entire campaign, visibly moved. And in living rooms in churches and community centers across America and in places as far away as Kenya, as Indonesia, as the small towns of Kansas, people wept. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough. Enough to mark that night as something genuinely, irreversibly different. The presidency itself was harder than the campaign. It almost always is. Obama inherited 2 wars, an economy in freefall, and a political system that had been corroding for decades. His first term was defined above all by the Affordable Care Act, the most significant expansion of the American healthcare system since the creation of Medicare in 1965. It passed without a single Republican vote. It was imperfect. It was fought over bitterly, in Congress and in courtrooms and in the public imagination. But it gave millions of Americans health coverage they had never had, and it represented a genuine achievement of governance. His foreign policy was complex and, in the eyes of many supporters, disappointing. He had promised to close Guantanamo Bay and never succeeded. He expanded drone warfare in ways that troubled civil libertarians. He approved the raid in Abbottabad, Pakistan, that killed Osama bin Laden, a moment that produced one of the most memorable photographs of his presidency, that cramped Situation Room image of him and his national security team watching the mission unfold in real time. He negotiated the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris Climate Agreement, both of which his successor would later abandon. He was re-elected in 2012 against Mitt Romney, and his second term was shadowed by the same forces that had defined his first, Republican opposition that had long since become something more than ordinary political disagreement, the rise of the Tea Party and then something darker and more virulent, and the grinding reality that transformative change in a democracy rarely happens quickly or cleanly. He announced the legalization of same-sex marriage support, which the Supreme Court would later enshrine as a constitutional right. He stood in churches after mass shootings and wept and sang Amazing Grace, because sometimes the only honest response to incomprehensible tragedy is to cry. He left office on January 20, 2017, with an approval rating of 60%, higher than when he had arrived. He shook hands with his successor, got on a helicopter, and left. The dignity of that departure, in the context of what followed, would come to feel significant in ways no one had fully anticipated. Barack Obama's legacy is contested, as all presidencies must be. His supporters see a man who governed with intelligence, integrity, and extraordinary grace under pressure, who shepherded the country through a financial crisis without a second Great Depression, who expanded healthcare access and moved the country toward renewable energy, who restored America's standing in much of the world after the damage of the Bush years, and who, simply by existing as the first black president, permanently expanded what Americans could imagine about themselves and their country. His critics, from the left, argue that he was too cautious, too deferential to Wall Street, too willing to compromise on progressive priorities. From the right, the criticism has been louder and often less charitable. But here is what is inarguable: Barack Obama was a man of genuine intellect and genuine belief who achieved something that virtually no one thought possible, and who did it not through luck or timing alone, but through years of discipline, learning, failure, resilience, and a refusal to reduce the complexity of the world to slogans. He is the son of a Kenyan economist and a Kansas anthropologist, the boy who grew up in Hawaii and Indonesia, the community organizer who got beaten badly in a congressional race, the state senator who bet everything on a speech, the candidate who changed American politics, the president who proved that history can be made even by people history was not supposed to include. That is the story of Barack Obama. Not a fairy tale. Not a myth. Something more interesting than either, a human life, lived at full force, in full public view, in a country still arguing, as it always has been, about what it actually wants to be.